We are live finally after I've managed to press the button. But yeah, we're back for another episode of Men as Allies, and we have Matt joining us this time, part of the crew, part of the Men as Allies crew. But yeah, I mean, we haven't actually done one of these for a couple of months, have we? So I think the last one was about June, where it was men as partners, not protectors, I think was the key thing we were discussing then. But we're moving on the conversation. The silent majority. I know this was a stat, the 4 out of 5 that astounded everybody when we talked to Graham Goulden. But welcome, guys. Lovely to have you joining us for this very important conversation. And I think I know I shared in a couple of posts the quite shocking statistics that came from the Girl Guiding survey around young girls' attitudes. And I think the one figure that really struck me was this figure that says 7 in 10 girls have changed their behaviour in order to feel safe. And that was something that, having done walks and talks locally and talked to young women here, that absolutely is echoed. But I think the thing is the only way we're going to change some of that narrative is that we have men working as allies. Hence, the conversation we're having this evening. But if that's how girls are responding, what is it that we're teaching boys, and what are they absorbing in this silence? So I guess I don't know. I mean, Dan, why is it that this is the place that we find ourselves in this silence? Is it silence, or is it just something more that I've missed?
The trouble is, Laura, right? And I remember when you first said to Mark and I about that you were going to set this up and create this place where we could come along and talk about being men as allies and talk about the violence against women and girls and the culture and both of us went, oh, what us straight white Christian blokes, you want us to come on? And I think then both of us went away, contemplated, and came back and thought, well, actually, if we're not part of the solution, we're part of the problem, right? And Mark made the comment today in his LinkedIn post that this, not all men, well, whilst obviously that's true, that is not a reasonable response anymore, right? Yeah. We're all on the same team here. None of us wants to live in this world where, those results from the Girl Guides, young girls are adjusting their behavior because they're frightened and they're scared and they're worried about being attacked or being taken advantage of, right? No, none of us wants to live in that world. Not one of us, right? No. So we've got to do something about that. And even if it's just to come together and say, we don't want this anymore, do we? Right. Okay, yeah. How do we tell a new story? Because this is cultural. This is top to bottom. This is about the way we've been brought up. This is about what we've allowed and what we've accepted and what we've brushed under the carpet and what we've ignored and what we've buried our heads in the sand and hope would go away. Go, not all men, don't hector these, not me, God. We're all responsible for this culture that we live in. We can't just point the fingers all the time and expect somebody else to sort it out. So we all know we don't want to live in this world. We all know we don't want the women and girls in our lives to be frightened and fearful and adjusting and changing their lives because of it. So therefore, we have to have a conversation. We have to look in the mirror, I think, for starters, Laura, and go, right, how much have I been part of this culture that exists? What have I done to perpetuate it? Even if it's little micro things that you've just explained away and rationalized and laughed at. And that's step one. You've got to look in the mirror. What have I done? Right. Okay. And then be brave enough to sit with how that makes you feel about yourself, and then be different. Be the change. Be what you want to see. Be the man you hope is the man that your daughter's going to meet and your wife's going to meet. And be that person, right? Understand what boundaries are. Understand that nobody has any entitlement over anybody else. And change we've got to have these conversations. The fact that we're all sat here today having a conversation, Laura, is a massive plus.
No, I agree. And I think that's, I know both Mark and Matt have got daughters as well. And I remember in a previous conversation, Mark, when we started this journey together, you'd had a conversation at the kitchen table with your wife about, you know, what made her feel safe versus, you know, it just wasn't something that you had consciously thought about previously. I mean, you know, and I guess that's half the thing, is having that conversation. You know, you know, Matt, you know, from your perspective, you know, how do you see it in your world?
In my world, I guess there's a few things that come to mind. One is, as you say, I have a daughter, and she's fearless, she's brave, she's outgoing, she's, you know, she's, yeah, scary. And I want her to maintain that. I want her to take that forwards. But as per that statistic that you said, you know, I almost find myself wanting to amend her behavior, not because there's anything wrong with her behavior, but because how that might be perceived and what that might mean. And I think, you know, I had a very real example of this, in that there was an incident at a previous school where young boys were running around and pulling down the skirts of the girls. Now, I know that conversations were had with the boys, but the main outcome that came out the back of it was that all girls were encouraged to wear cycling shorts under their skirts. To the extent that one time recently, where my daughter got changed for a party that we were at, and she put her skirts on, she was like, oh, I don't have my cycling shorts. I don't know. Where are they? And she doesn't now feel comfortable without them. And it just strikes me that this is the world that we're creating right now, where it's about how do you manage and mitigate rather than let's fix the problem in the first place.
So true, Matt. I hadn't even thought, and you have, you have to, because, you know, as you know, I have 5 nieces, and I've never, and you just giving that example about why they're all wearing cycling shorts, and why, you know, Rosie, my youngest niece, gets quite perturbed that she hasn't got her cycling shorts. For me, I hadn't even crossed my mind, but you're absolutely right. If that's how they're set, you know, effectively getting around the problem, that they can't predict that behavior, but actually surely shouldn't they be helping these young boys understand that is just not the right thing to do? Mark, I'm astounded. I mean, I'm sure with your girls are a bit older though, aren't they?
Yeah, but look, at the cycling shorts thing was a thing that they wouldn't leave the house without either, like when they were going to school, because they were wearing their skirts, like in order to feel comfortable. Like, isn't it a classic example of women have to be the solution to what is a man's problem, you know, and therefore we are offloading the solution again. Like, as Dan was talking there at the start, I was thinking, and it's related, but it's a different story. I remember there's an Irish athlete, Rashida Adeleke, and she's of Nigerian parentage, and she is outrageous. Like, she fought to the Olympics, and you know, she had a post talking about how she got racist abuse, and like underneath the post was loads of, oh, you're brilliant, you're wonderful, and then towards the end there was some racist comments, and I was nearly looking down for the racist comments. I saw them, I was about to reply, and then I stopped myself. I thought, no, I'm not going to reply. Like, no, I'm not going to bother getting involved in that, right? And then I realized afterwards, by not replying, I was just accepting. And so it was my job was to actually call out the racist comment, like, you know, in the same as this point to those boys, like, by just saying, oh guys, don't, but not calling out the behavior, then we're accepting the behavior in its own way. And therefore we're saying to women, well, you have to be the solution to our problem. Like how often do you hear that line about, well, if you're going to dress like that, you know, like, that's not that person's fault, you know. Like in Islamic culture, you know, the full burqa has a point, like it has a purpose in that way. It's a protection from men, like, you know. And I've often spoken to Islamic women who say that the freedom they feel because of it is extraordinary. Now, I'm not about to say this is a good thing, right? But again, that's an example of women having to be the solution for a man problem, you know, as opposed to the man taking the responsibility for a man problem so that women don't have to be the solution. And like, it's a sea change in culture, it's a sea change in thinking, it's a sea change, but it starts with the sea change in conversation, you know. And I know it's come up a lot of times before. And Dan, you rightly pointed out, you left WhatsApp groups because of the commentary and because of how the conversations were going in them, you know. Are we calling out what's not acceptable? Are we putting our hand up and saying, hold on, lads, like, you know, here we are 2025, like, you know, like, you know, are we saying, hey, you have a daughter, you know? And there is this, oh, it's locker room talk, right? But, you know, is that still excuse? Is that still not all men, you know? Is locker room, we're not quite, but, you know, we are, but we're not, you know? Where's the line that we have to cross? Where's the line that can we see the line in order to cross the line?
It's such a good point. I think it, you know, I've got so many thoughts going through my mind, because, you know, I do think it starts with conversation, because, you know, as I say often, we don't know what we don't know. You know, just in the same way I'm, as a woman, you know, hearing Matt's story about her daughter, or the, you know, the situation with his daughter, the situation in the school, you know, I'm surprised myself. But unless we have these conversations in a forum where we're talking openly, those dialogues don't happen, those conversations don't happen, and therefore we're actually perpetuating the silence or the shift of, you know, whose responsibility it actually is. You know, and I suppose that's the key bit, is that it's everybody's responsibility to step into the conversation. But there's still probably a large proportion of people who are in blissful denial that there is any need to step into that space. Or am I, you know, underestimating?
No, I think you're right, Lauren, particularly the status quo that we have, right? Which is blame the victim. Oh, yeah. Well, you shouldn't have left your window open. It's like, well, I should be able to leave all my windows and doors open in my house if I want, and hope that my fellow humans are going to respect me and my space and my stuff enough to not just come piling in, right? Yeah. And it's the same thing, isn't it? It's like, well, women must adjust their behavior. Women must adjust their lives. Women must not go here at these times, wear this, do that. And it's like, come on, right? But this is, we can't just keep perpetuating that same old tired stuff that clearly doesn't work. Look at the world we're living in, right? And it's one of the few violent crimes that consistently rises is violence against women and girls, and just violence, full stop, right? Where's our respect for firstly for ourselves and then for our fellow human beings, right? If every one of us looked in the mirror, we'd all say to ourselves, well, I respect myself, I respect other people, right? And then, like Mark said, oh, but I have a little bit of locker room bants, but that's just a laugh, isn't it, right? Oh, I make a few jokes with a lad, but that's just, I don't mean that. That's just fun. And it isn't, right? And I'm not saying I'm better than anyone else here. I've been there. I've been in those locker rooms. I've made those jokes. I've been in those places, right? I've done it. I've been part of this problem. I've been part of this culture. Absolutely, I have. I remember years and years ago, one of my first jobs at the BBC was dealing with their incoming emails and texts while they were BBC Breakfast Telly, while they were on air. And I've sent a really stupid reply to someone who'd emailed in about a story we'd done about rape. She was making a perfectly good point that we'd done that age-old thing of blame victim and all this sort of thing. And I argued the point with her. And that was the first time ever a seed was planted in my head when I zoomed out and I looked back and I went, oh my God, what? She's right. What am I doing? Why am I arguing that point as the BBC? So from Dan, BBC, and I just thought, and that was the first time I realised that this culture that we live in and this accepted narrative, right? Not all men, stay safe kind of thing. It's like, at what point do we change this conversation and go, actually, don't people have a right to go about their business without fear of violence? Don't we have enough respect and self-control for ourselves that we don't have to dominate and control and be violent to people, right? Do we not know ourselves well enough to be able to execute that? And sadly, the answer is no, right? But no. As I said at the start, none of us wants to live in this world. None of us. So what do? We just keep being part of the same old tired rubbish? Or do we at some point look in the mirror and go, we've got to do something different. We've got to talk about things differently. We've got to say to our mates, do you know what, mate? I'm not accepting that. I'm not having that. I'm not having you talk about somebody in that way. I don't find that joke funny. We're allowed to do that. And then that person's going to go home and take a look at themselves. calling it out and calling it in, right? There's these two competing things here. Sometimes, like Mark was saying, that when you see something like that and you have an opportunity, you have to call it out. Like you have to say, do you know what? That's not on. But the better thing to do, if you can, is call people in. You say, come on, this doesn't fly anymore. Here's the consequences of what you're doing. Here's what it's contributing to. Here's this narrative. We don't want this narrative anymore, do we? So let's stop it. Let's change it.
Yeah, I mean, the call them in is something that, you know, Graham talks about. And I suppose that's the thing that I have in my head. I mean, I suppose, Matt, you know, how do we call people in? How do we activate more, you know, voices? I mean, I guess to both you and Mark, in your world, how do you see that we can activate and ignite the voices of those male allies so that there are, you know, more people walking alongside women as opposed to, you know, kind of the locker room banter?
Well, if I equate it to my world, and my world is all around burnout and coaching and helping people build resilience and stress resilience, etc. And the flip side of that is around the management structures that have created the environments that lead to burnout. And, you know, there's a denial of a problem there quite often as well. You know, so what if I, as the manager, am sending emails at 11 o'clock at night? So what if I, as a manager, am never seen to be taking lunch? That's my choice. So what if I, as a manager, am still in the office at 8 o'clock at night? You know, well, so what is that people see that and people feel that that is the way that you have to act to be successful. And it's the same, I kind of feel here, you know, so what if I'm not speaking up at this point? You know, I'm not the problem, you know, I'm not creating the problem, I'm just doing my thing. Well, if that's the case, then we never shift the dialogue and we never actually get any movement. The same way, slowly we're starting to have these discussions about positive workplaces and the benefits that they have and commerciality of that. It's only going to happen with this kind of dialogue and a recognition that, as I think it was Dan said right at the start, you know, we're saying we're not part of the problem. Well, actually, it's our behaviors in not doing this. It's our behaviors in doing our own thing that are exemplifying to other men. Yeah, that's fine. Get on with it. Don't need to say anything. So I think the more that we actually do speak out, the more it makes it okay to. I think there's still this sort of feeling that it's, don't be woke, don't be salty, don't talk out in this way. But until we do, and until more people do, it's not going to change the overall dialogue and narrative around the issue.
No, I'm totally with you, Matt, and I think you're absolutely right. You know, our organisations are set up with that narrative that, you know, I can send an email at 11 o'clock. I mean, even I do it. And I remember very vividly somebody, it was actually a guy who worked for me many years ago, but he called me out on it. And it has stuck with me forever since then, is because you are role modelling effectively a way of being. And he just said it's very, I forget the exact word, but effectively he was saying to me, it's just making me feel like, why should I bother? Because you're setting a standard that is nigh on impossible to achieve, and you know that this sort of like standard is not real, it's not a stepping forward. And I mean, okay, the tables were turned in that situation, but ever since that individual shared with me that impact, it is stuck in my brain. I mean, it happened probably about almost 20 years ago now, but that set the way I wanted to then lead as a result of that. And I think that's very much what you're talking about here, is men willing to step into that type of role modeling. I mean, Mark, I'm sure this is something that you see.
as you were talking there, right, a couple of things really spring to mind. Like, I started working with a lady there recently, and before we were working together, she challenged me by saying, have you worked with women leaders who also have to negotiate, or how have you worked with women leaders who also have to negotiate being a woman in a male environment? And I thought, like, wow, no one's ever asked me how I've done that before, right? It's come up in conversation, how we do that. But when she said it to me, how I was like, Jesus, I don't know. And there was that moment where I realized, God, it is different. It is completely different. It is another element that I do not have to think about, you know? And like, we think of it from that safety perspective, like, you know, and about, like, you know, you share that, you mentioned that Girl Guides thing today when you were commenting on the post. So obviously I went and Googled it. I see there's one for every single year. And like, you know, the first number that caught my attention was who would walk with a key in their hand, you know? Like, you know, so like, it just goes to show you the additional mental load that is added because of this space now that we don't even know about. Like, I've never thought about it. Like, as you were talking there, I was thinking about where have I felt the safest, right? In terms of, you know, you go out at night, you're in a city, whatever country you're in, right? There's an element, even as a man, where you're like, no, there's a sketchy, that's a bit dodgy, you know, is that all right? Is that okay? You know, don't take that. Oh Jesus, no, I'm not buying off him, right? Whatever, but you know what I mean? But like, it's the element of the danger that's there, right? And I recall it was actually in Pakistan where I was, that I felt in one particular small town incredibly safe, because it was such a safe environment, like in the space that I was in. And it actually dawned on me that, like, wow, so this is what feeling completely safe is. So how far away from that level of safety does a woman feel in society and in public, right? And I think it's extraordinary, the mental load that we don't have an awareness of. And I think that's part of the problem, you know? Like, when I looked at this, the dog came in, so I paused this for a second, right? And I couldn't hear it for a second, right? I was trying to shout at somebody to get the fucking dog out. When I was looking back, I saw the four squares. I was thinking, you know, remember that Sesame Street thing, right? It was one of these kids is doing their own thing, you know?
Yeah.
And like, you know, find out when it's different. And it's you in this space, Laura, because we don't get this, because we don't understand it. And I think that's also part of the problem. So as much as we talk about the need for us to make sure this conversation is going, we're not listening either. We're not listening. And I think that's a part of the problem. It's just why we struggle to have these conversations, because we don't quite know how to cut someone off, how to stop it, because we don't really know the truth of why we're trying to stop it. We have an idea of it, we have an impression of it, we have a vision of what it should look like, but we don't know. And I think so it comes in two parts. And I think maybe, and I know I'm responsible for this, because I've had arguments with my wife about she should feel safe, you know, right? I've had that argument, and I'm wrong. Like, you should. Anyone, like, you can't tell anyone they should anything, you know, because that's the space that they're in. And I said, I think it comes back to that piece. If we're going to talk, we also need to listen.
That is what I was going to say. You know, we need to build better ears. You know, I mean, I think that's true for everybody, to be fair, you know, men and women alike. But and I think you know, that's what's on it. You know, the example that you gave when we first kicked off this conversation back in March was the conversation you'd had about your wife not feeling comfortable to run first thing in the morning, despite the fact there being loads of cars, and you know, this whole don't really understand why that. And I think the challenge you have as men, and I will hold my hand up as a woman equally, because what makes people feel safe can be so different. You know, I mean, Matt and I both live in Tunbridge Wells. I personally do not feel unsafe in Tunbridge Wells. So it alarmed me to hear other women talking about the fact that they will not feel safe coming into the centre of Tunbridge Wells town centre on an evening. And that once it gets darker, they won't come in unless they're already meeting a friend before they step in. Even I don't necessarily understand it, because my experiences of, you know, feeling safe and everything, I think in South America and Rio de Janeiro, I did feel a little unsafe at that point. You know, you go around a couple of the wrong streets and you definitely feel unsafe. But I don't here. But that's because of the experiences, the broader experiences I've had. So, you know, equally, I have to do better listening. But I think I think you've hit the nail on the head, Mark, with what you're saying. It's not just being the role model that we're talking about. It's not just saying, it's a problem, therefore, the girls have to adapt their behaviour. It's actually listening and having the better ears as to, what is, specific to you, what makes you feel unsafe, because it could be so unbelievably different for every woman and girl based on the experiences that they've had. And so, therefore, to that same point, it does mean it's a bit of a minefield for anybody else, because you just go, oh my God, well, if it's that stressful, then I can't think about it. But actually, how hard is it just to pause and say, well, and ask? I know, is it that simple?
And that's it, Laura, isn't it? And it's approaching it with curiosity and not dismissing and not shutting down. It's very easy for me to sit here and go, well, you should feel safe, and actually you're not unsafe. Like, I could say to my wife, go for, you take the dog out there, there's nobody here, of course you should feel safe, because logic and reason tells me statistically. But it's not about logic or reason. We're talking about how people feel here, right? Yeah. Which isn't logical and isn't reasonable. We're talking about fear. We're talking about how fear drives our perception, right? We live in a safer world than ever, yet at the moment it really doesn't feel like that, does it? We don't. No. The majority of people don't feel like we live in a safe world where the crime rate's low and we're actually more secure than we've ever been, because of the general conversations and the general narrative. And I think one of the things that kind of perpetuates that is just the lack of understanding, right? Yeah. When the propensity in this country to start blaming immigrants for all our problems, it comes from a lack of understanding of what the real problem is. And if we don't listen and we don't understand, then we'll never know what the real problem is. And all we'll have is our half-baked perception based entirely on our own experience. Don't dismiss people, be curious. So don't say, oh, well, you should feel safe, like Mark's reaction was. And we've all done that. We've all done that, because naturally we just go, hang on a minute, of course you're safe. What are you on about? Listen.
I've done that as well, though. And I suppose that's my point is, and I think that's part of the reason why it's so important we have these conversations.
Why, Laura, isn't it? We've got to say, okay, so you don't feel, why don't you feel safe? And then when you hear the story behind it, or why, how that they've come to that conclusion, or how that perception has been built, and you're like, oh, okay, because we have never experienced it. There are very few times in my life where I walked the streets and not felt safe. Very, very few. I'm a privileged white man. I get that, but what I want to do is understand those people that are, and especially women and girls that are walking the streets and they're not feeling safe. Why is that? What can I do about that to make it different? What's the story behind that? What's got them to this point? What's made them draw those conclusions? Be curious about it. And then you can, to an extent, walk in their shoes a bit, right? Because it's really hard for us to do that. It's it's hard for anybody when you've got no frame of reference, no point of experience where you can say, oh yeah, that's happened to me, I know what that's like. We haven't. So it is tough to understand, and it does take a little bit of curiosity and a little bit of open-mindedness and spotting the stories that we tell and what we're bringing to the table in terms of our own fears and perceptions and biases and prejudices. It takes a bit of that, right? So it's not easy, but it's doable, isn't it? Just train yourself. I train myself to be a much better listener. I volunteer for the Samaritans. I'm a coach, right? And listening is the key to coaching. And what I did was I just told myself all the time, the minute I was going to come out with, I think, blah, 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 shut the F up. Because nobody cares what I think, Laura. And why should they?
No.
And I think in terms of what you're saying there, and this kind of brings the conversation almost back full circle a little bit again, is it's not just about the curiosity to listening to what the women are saying. It's also, for me, the curiosity about what the men are saying and experiencing, who are actually perpetuating the problem. Not the silent majority who say, I'm not doing anything, it's not me. But those that feel certain things that mean that that's their response, that sort of, the violence. And again, we can tell them, oh, you can't do that, until we're blue in the face. But until we actually stop and listen and try and understand what's going on for them as well, we're not going to be able to change the situation either.
And that's a really good point, because I think, invariably, there are various different extremes of, the violence. Look, I totally get that. But I think there is a middle ground where actually there could be more people being called out or called in, as Graham would call it, where it is, like people just being, and the word that's come to me in just you describing that, Matt, was to have compassion for people. And because, inevitably, it's often that anger, that aggression, that perspective is coming from a place of, per se, defensiveness sometimes, a place of them feeling like they are failing, and this is what they, it's a bit back to the should conversation. And therefore, I suppose the question I then go to, and Mark, you might have some thoughts on this, is like, so what do we have to do differently that, to Matt's point, sort of talks to those individuals? What is it that we have to do differently beyond just the curiosity and listening?
Well, because the word violence has been used quite a bit here, right? And we always think of violence as a physical act, but violence is language too, and maybe a part of it is the actual language that we're using, how we're couching these things, how we're shaping it and framing it in the language that we use, which again is probably part of the problem, because there's a cultural language that probably have taken from cowboy and western films that are originated in the 40s and 50s and 60s through America, and there's that certain stereotypes that is built up out of that. And I think that's an important part of how we begin to address this, is how we address the language that we use to discuss and talk about certain things. It doesn't mean we stop talking about them. It doesn't mean we avoid certain stuff that feels wrong, but it means we're very careful of how we speak about it with certain people. Like to the point that, some people should feel safe, but they don't feel safe, right? And what is it that they don't feel safe about? What is it that makes them not feel safe? Is there something actually traumatic in this? Is there something much deeper that we don't understand or don't see? Is there a PTSD element here that we are igniting based on how we are framing stuff and how we are using the language that we want to talk about it like? And again, I think that has to form a part of the conversation. What is a better language that we can use to talk about this? And maybe, Laura, that's what comes from the joint part of the conversation. That's what comes from the allies part of the conversation, that we find language that we can talk about things in a normalized way, that we can talk about things in a look, I go so far as to say, right, and then I'll use a female example of this, right, and this is where a friend of mine who's Finnish, and she was talking about how in the primary school they were talking about the body with their kids, right, and her daughter, the mothers on the thing were complaining about the teacher using the word vagina to talk about the body, and she saw a few comments of this and they said they should be using some other word, like, or a code word or something like this. And after a while she said, I've had enough of this, like, and she just lit on them all. Like, said, this is disgraceful. No wonder you have an issue with sexuality in this country. No wonder you have issues in this part of the world if you cannot name body parts. And I think that goes for us as adults, because we evolve from these children to teenagers to not actually having these conversations about body parts in a normalized way, like you'd talk about an arm or a finger or whatever else. We constantly sexualize things without removing them from the sexualized aspect of it and making them part of a body. And maybe that's where the conversation needs to go too, that we take away every other bow that we've attached to these things and talk about them as they are, as opposed to what we put into them.
It's such a good point, because I think it's finding that, you've called it normalized language, that common language where we're not having to, hide away, where it's a sort of almost secret code that, people have, because But I think, again, it comes back to, unless you're having those conversations and those conversations are open and honest, then the reality is that, you know, it does go back to the secret code, and then it's all hush hush, and, you know, and that's usually about their discomfort as opposed to anything else. And again, that comes back to the point of like, well, it's uncomfortable because we don't talk about it openly and honestly enough. And I guess it kind of comes, you know, sort of full circle to me. It's like, is it therefore really about, you know, having the strength to stand and having open and honest conversations where, you know, they aren't closed rooms, so that it can be explored, so that a combined language can happen, so that people can, you know, women and men can work as active allies together. I mean, you know, if I massively oversimplified it, I get that, you know, I'm talking about societal and cultural change.
I mean, just in this world right now, we're all so busy shouting at each other, aren't we? Can we all, for a second, shut up and let's have a sensible, nuanced, adult discussion? Can we do that? Could, you know, any chance? Instead of just slinging mud at each other all the time, can we remember there is more that unites us than divides us? Can we all just take a second and go, we're all more similar than we are different? Stop focusing on what makes us different. Stop dividing us. Stop pointing fingers. Stop blaming people. Can we all just be open and honest and talk about stuff like body parts without using euphemisms? You know, it's the silence and the secrecy that causes all the problems. This is the problem with our culture, is, you know, we don't discuss sex, and we don't talk about relationships, and, you know, that everyone goes nuts when they talk about bringing some sort of sexual education in for primary school age kids. It's like, well, at what point do we start talking about this? And then when we do, are we going to have to pussyfoot around because we haven't given them the tools in the first place to understand what it is that we're talking about? And you're just missing a huge part of your education as a human being as to natural things that work and how they do and they don't. And then we expect people to go out as adults and understand boundaries and what is and isn't acceptable. Nobody's ever had that conversation with them.
No, I'm totally with you, Dan. So very conscious of time, but I don't know, because I think there's so much that this conversation could have. We could probably talk for quite some time about it. But I mean, in your mind, Matt, you know, what do you think is one thing that we all can be doing to, you know, allow men's voice, or coming back to this thing where I'm just thinking it's actually just voices. It's not just men's voices, it's voices generally. But let's go with men's voices. How can we get more men's voices, you know, in a place where they can feel they can speak up, they can call out this behaviour, so that actually, you know, we can start to change some of this narrative? You know, what's the key for you?
I think the key for me was a word you mentioned earlier on, and that's compassion. We are human. And to be human is to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. We've spoken about how on this we've told women they should be safe or should feel safe. You know, that's a mistake. And we've said, you know, we made a mistake. And you know what? I'm guilty of making mistakes. You know, I've stepped across boundaries that I didn't think was a boundary, and then, you know, being shown that it is a boundary. And it's when people do that, when they make those mistakes, the temptation in culture right now is, as you say, to shout, "You're wrong, you're terrible, you're bad." But to just treat it a little bit more with compassion and with Dan's word, curiosity. Okay, well, where does that come from? Why do you think that's okay? You know, we need to be more compassionate on both sides of the debate so that the conversation can flow more.
No, I'm, you know, this word compassion, just, we are so quick to criticize, you know, judge, reject, you know, generally. And where is that compassion? Where is that seeking to understand, you know, another perspective? Well, one, we're too busy in our own noise, but, you know, that doesn't help. I know, Dan, what is the one key thing that you think? I mean, I dare say you're going to tell me curiosity, but
no, I'm going to say integrity, Laura.
Okay.
I'm going to say look into your heart, understand what you feel about this, and what the world you want to live in. What world do you want to live in? Then be that person. Have integrity with yourself and who you really are, and have the integrity to do what Matt just did there, and hold your hands up and say, yeah, I have crossed that line. I've said some things that weren't appropriate, but I came from a world that told me it was. Okay.
Yeah.
So now I understand it isn't. And I'm going to talk about it. Yeah, here's some things I said that weren't funny that I thought were funny. Here's some things I did that I thought were okay that weren't okay. The more we can have those conversations in a quiet, calm, reasonable way, the more we can act with integrity, the better we'll all be.
No, that's a good shout. And yeah, it is about being, having integrity with ourselves, and that's true for everybody, I think. And Mark, where are your thoughts to close our conversation off for this evening? What's the one thing for you?
Well, I suppose we're always living in the world, but we're also creating the world for those who are coming after us.
Mm.
So if we don't do it now, what are we leaving for the ones that are coming after us? And as I say that, my vision is I see my daughter walking down the street, and I see my other daughter walking down the street. And so I want them to feel like they're safe for as long as possible. And I know, Matt, you had a comment today in my post about your 9-year-old, it's that idea of, because there's an innocence there to be protected, an innocence there to be preserved for as long as possible, because it's magic when it still survives. But we don't want the innocence to be shattered by a world that we have created, as opposed to the innocence to be supported or held, or slowly let the world reveal itself in the right way, because we've created that. So I think integrity is vital, absolutely, and compassion is vital. And I think we need to keep focused on the fact that we're creating the world in front of us. We're creating the world for those coming after us. So if we want them to live in the better world, then we need to do the work now to make it happen.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. And I think it is that, we might not have done it before, but now is as good as any to start that change, because we can't just say, oh, it's not our problem. We really can't. Thank you, as ever, guys. If everybody has enjoyed this conversation, I do hope everybody's going to be back to join us at the end of October for our next conversation. And have a fabulous evening, one and all.
Thanks, all.
Thank you.
Thank you.